In this section, we're going to download, compile, and install the Courier MTA authentication daemon. In subsequent sections, we'll install the IMAP server, which also includes support for POP3. But we need to initially get the authentication daemon up and running because it provides the backend authentication that's required by both POP3 as well as IMAP services. Let's log in as Linux CVT SUSE 1. And since Courier MTA is not bundled with SUSE Enterprise Linux, we're going to download the sources from the Courier website. Let's close the pop-up and we'll launch our Conqueror browser. And we'll navigate to courier-mta.org. This is the homepage for the Courier mail server. Courier is a full-fledged standalone mail server suite, which also includes support for the common protocols, ESMTP, IMAP, and so on. But its components can be used with other mail servers, and we're going to show you how to use the additional components, such as the authentication library and the IMAP and POP3 components, along with postfix. So if your mailer is postfix, sendmail, or qmail, you can use Courier. Now, Courier supports for retrieval by default mail dir, which we've looked at, which is an alternate way of storing mail messages, which represents messages as individual files rather than concatenating the messages into one mbox related file. As I've mentioned, it offers superior performance and scalability. So again, if you intend to use Courier Mail Server, ensure that the MTA that you're using supports mail dir or mail dir. If it doesn't, Courier won't work because it doesn't support the old-fashioned mbox style. Great. Now this is for the entire mail server. If you're interested just in the components like we are, you want to navigate to the IMAP server section as well as the authorization section. Let's go to the IMAP server. This page is dedicated strictly for the IMAP server, and there's a link here that provides us access to the authentication library so that we can download the auth lib separately. We'll navigate to the download section, and we'll click on the link which allows us to download, which contains the separate components that are supported. Let's scroll all the way up, and here's the main package for Courier, and subsequent packages are to follow. We're interested again in this section in the authentication library, so let's download it. It's available in BZ2 format. We'll download it via HTTP, and optionally we can download a signature to check the authenticity of this particular package. Let's find a local mirror, something that's close. We'll go with Voxrox, which is in New York City. And we should have our download pop up momentarily. Let's save it. And we'll place it one level up to our home directory. And we're going to extract it in the home directory and set it up. The Courier installation package is well thought out. It includes run level scripts for starting up the system automatically for both System 5 and BSD compliant systems, and it places its required files and dependent files in nice, neat locations. It's very easy to keep track of both the authentication library and the IMAP packages. So installation's a breeze. It's pretty straightforward. Again, we need the auth library to act as a proxy on behalf of the authorization and authentication requests. Now that we have the package, let's minimize the Conqueror browser, open a shell, and we'll see the BZ2 file in our home directory. If we lsltr, here it is, Courier auth lib. Now it's a good idea to compile the auth lib and IMAP packages as a non-root user, otherwise Courier will complain. So notice we're logged in as a non-root user. It's evidenced by the fact that the bash shell does not terminate with a hash mark, and whoami tells us who we are, and the prompt indicates it, and so on. So let's tar xjvf Courier auth lib. This will create the subdirectory tree. Now there are some requirements. You can double check their website, Courier's website, since it is a moving target. Requirements may vary over time. But as it stands, the current requirements include that you have the C++ compiler installed on your system, as well as the expect program. So simply rpm query and grep, we'll do a query all to grep for the expect package, although it's actually called expect. If it's not installed, install it. Also grep for the C packages, and we have GCC installed but no GCC plus or GC plus plus. We can do a which G++, and you can see it's not in our system. So these two packages need to be installed. Let's launch YAST. Otherwise, during the configure process, Courier will complain that it's unable to find both the C++ compiler as well as expect. Now expect's required because it actually allows us the ability to update the passwords that are in the etc password file. Again, the auth functions on behalf of requests. So what it does, requests from the calling client. So what it does is actually make changes. Well, it actually interacts with your user database source, whether it's LDAP, MySQL, or the etc, the standard Unix etc password file. And it can also change passwords for you, but it uses the expect program's capability to do so. Here's an error regarding SMTP daemon. This can be ignored because we purposely remove the mail server that's installed by default on the SUSE Enterprise system for the sake of illustrating how to compile postfix from the sources. Let's search for expect. We'll select it. There's also a Perl expect interface if you plan to script with Perl. We're prompted for CD2, so let's give it CD2. We'll click OK. We've just inserted CD number 2. And we'll be prompted whether we want to install more packages. We'll say yes to install more. Let's install and remove software. And now let's search for GCC. We'll see the GCC++ packages. Let's install it. It installs a required package, and this time it requires CD3. So let's put in CD number 3. We'll click OK. CD3 is now in, and we'll have our C++ compiler install. Some packages require C++ or C, depending on how the program was written, the language in which the program was written in. Now we have what we need. Let's move on. A which G++ will reflect that it's now in user bin, and an rpm grep for expect will also reflect that expect's available. Let's navigate into the courier auth subdirectory, and here we have all the files that you're accustomed to seeing, or many of the files you're accustomed to seeing when compiling a package, including the install file, the configure related files, and so on. Let's launch configure. That's the first step. Now this process can take a while depending on the speed of your system. Our system's a pretty quick system. It's a dual processor Xeon box with hyperthreading enabled, so it appears to be 4 processors, so we should be able to run through the process pretty quickly. Once this is complete, we'll execute make, and make will actually compile the binaries or create the actual binaries for us that we'll use to run the auth program. And once that's complete, we'll actually install it as the root user so that we can place the files in the directories throughout the system. Now again, the auth acts as a proxy on behalf of the calling user. You may use an application such as Kmail or Thunderbird or maybe even Outlook Express using IMAP or POP3 for authentication. That is handed off when received by the courier IMAP package to the request, that is, to the auth package which should be running, the auth daemon which should be running. By default, by the way, it starts up 5 instances of itself so it can handle multiple requests simultaneously. So an inbound request is received by the protocol of choice, IMAP or POP3 and so on, and then handed over to IMAP, over to the auth which performs the authentication on behalf of the IMAP process or POP3 process. Let's open a separate shell to illustrate. So the client, perhaps Kmail, sends a request to your IMAP or POP3 server, which then hands off the authentication request to the courier auth daemon which runs as auth daemon, which then goes and queries the necessary repository. The default, of course, is etc password, but it can also include MySQL, LDAP, and so on. So from the client to the respective daemon, which is usually IMAP or POP3 or their secure counterparts, to the courier auth daemon, which is a separate process, and then to the user database to be queried. Now our configure process is complete. Let's launch make. This will actually create the binaries for us. And this will also run for a little bit, but not as long as the configure process. And once that's in place, what we'll then do is execute a make install, then a make install configure, which is required for first-time installations for setting up the config files. The courier package is well designed in that it separates the placement of the configuration files from the binaries. So when you run a make install, it simply places the binaries, the updated binaries, but a make install configure places new configuration files which are required upon first-time installation. The benefit of this particular approach is that it prevents overwriting existing configuration files which may have taken you time to tailor, although the defaults are generally fine. Now let's execute a make install. We'll need to su in. This will be or would be unable to do as a non-privileged user. Let's execute make install. This will set up the courier auth in the proper directories, including user local sbin as well as user local etc auth for the configuration files. Now let's execute the last step, which is make install -configure. This will place the configuration files in the proper locations. So quickly, let's take a look at what's been placed in our system. We'll navigate into user local sbin, and there's now a subdirectory called auth, or a file in sbin that is called auth daemon. This is the daemon that we're going to execute in start mode. The auth daemon that's been placed, this fresh binary on March 9th that's been placed in this directory, consults user local etc auth and it reads the auth daemon rc configuration file. So if there are any changes that need to be made to tailor or to be tailored for your system, you'd more than likely make it in the auth daemon rc file, which is in user local etc. The defaults, again, are generally fine, but if you are in requirement of a heavier duty configuration, such as more daemons for handling more simultaneous connections, then increase the number of daemons, and so on. If you notice performance issues, but generally the defaults that are included with the courier auth are fine. This is the default spool directory, and so on. And the file's pretty small. Now at this stage, if we'd like to start the daemon, simply execute a user sbin auth, and that's user local sbin, not user sbin, user local sbin auth daemon, and we can execute start. A psax grep auth will reflect the 5 instances of the process, of course including the master process which started the subsequent processes. So now auth daemon's up. It's not actually bound to any given TCP or UDP port or any socket. It is, however, ready to talk to any of the other courier processes such as IMAP and POP3 that need authentication. Now if auth daemon isn't running, then the authentication process will not work when the IMAP and or POP3 processes attempt to run. So next we're going to download the IMAP package which contains POP3, compile it, install it, then we'll go off to testing POP3 access, then IMAP access, and so on.